You didn't imagine it. That quiet discomfort in your chest, the one you couldn't quite name. It showed up in the small moments, the subtle shifts, the things that didn't look wrong on the surface, but felt wrong somewhere deeper. And you kept pushing it down. Because nothing looked that bad. They weren't loud. They didn't rage like the stereotypes you'd heard about. In fact, they seemed gentle, thoughtful even. The kind of person others trusted. And that's what made it so confusing. Because behind closed doors, something wasn't right. And you felt it. Covert narcissists don't announce themselves. They slip into your life quietly, almost carefully. They study you, mirror you, make you feel seen in ways that feel rare. And just when you start to relax, something shifts. Not dramatically. Just enough to make you question yourself. You start wondering if you're too sensitive, too demanding, too emotional. And they don't even have to say it directly. It's in the way they sigh, the way they withdraw. The way affection becomes conditional without ever being labeled that way. And the intimacy, that's where it gets even harder to explain. Because from the outside, everything might look normal. But behind the scenes, there's a pattern. A quiet, unsettling pattern that leaves you feeling used, unseen, and strangely alone, even when they're right next to you. You try to talk about it, carefully, gently, and somehow it turns around on you. Suddenly you're the one with the problem. The one who's too much. And now you're not just confused, you're starting to doubt your own reality. This is where most people get stuck. Because there's no clear explosion. No obvious abuse. Just a slow erosion. A drip, drip, drip of emotional confusion that keeps you hooked, trying to fix something you can't quite define. And here's the truth no one says out loud enough. Covert narcissism doesn't just damage your confidence. It distorts your sense of intimacy. It rewires how you connect, how you trust, how you interpret closeness itself. You start adapting, shrinking, becoming easier, quieter, more accommodating, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'll meet you there. But they don't. And deep down, you know it's not because you haven't tried hard enough. So the real question becomes, what are they actually doing beneath the surface? What are these quiet, sickening patterns that leave you feeling drained, confused, and emotionally starved, without ever having proof you can point to? A covert narcissist doesn't crave connection the way you do. They crave control, but in a way that looks like vulnerability. It's subtle, almost invisible. They don't dominate the room. They study it, and they learn exactly how to position themselves inside your emotional world. Intimacy, for them, isn't about closeness. It's about access. Access to your emotions, your empathy, your attention. And once they have that, they start shaping it, slowly. Not enough for you to notice at first, but enough to keep you slightly off balance. They'll open up just enough to pull you in. Share something personal. Something that makes you feel trusted. And just when you lean closer, they pull back. Not completely. Just enough to make you chase that closeness again. It becomes a pattern. You reaching. Them retreating. You trying to understand. Them becoming harder to read. And over time, you don't even realize you've been trained to work for scraps of emotional connection. And here's the part that stings. They know exactly what they're doing. Maybe not consciously in every moment, but instinctively. They've learned that inconsistency creates attachment. That unpredictability keeps you invested. In intimate moments, this shows up as emotional withholding. They're physically present, but emotionally distant. Or emotionally intense one day and cold the next. It keeps you guessing. Keeps you trying. Keeps you hooked. They don't meet you in vulnerability. They observe yours. Almost like data. Learning what affects you, what triggers you, what makes you stay. And then they use that knowledge, not to connect, but to maintain control. And when you start noticing the pattern, that's when the subtle gaslighting begins. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that makes you second-guess your own instincts instead of questioning them. You're overthinking. That's not what I meant. Why do you always assume the worst? These phrases don't sound abusive. But over time, they chip away at your ability to trust yourself. And that's the real strategy. Because once you stop trusting your own perception, you start relying on theirs. And that's exactly where they want you. Emotionally dependent, slightly confused, and constantly trying to recalibrate. There comes a moment when something clicks. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just a quiet realization that keeps tapping at you. Something isn't adding up. And for the first time, you don't ignore it. Maybe it's the way they pull away right after a moment of closeness. Or how they seem almost irritated when you express a need. Something about it feels rehearsed. Like you've seen this pattern before. You start paying attention. Not reacting, just observing. And suddenly, things you once excused begin to form a pattern. A very clear, very intentional pattern. And it's unsettling. Their affection feels timed. Strategic. Almost like it appears exactly when you're about to emotionally disconnect. And disappears the moment you feel safe again. It's not random. It's calculated. You test it. Pull back slightly. Say less. Give less. And watch. And what happens next tells you everything. They don't lean in. They don't fight for connection. They shift tactics. Suddenly, they become the victim. Subtle but effective. A sigh. A distant look. A quiet statement about feeling unappreciated. And just like that, the focus moves away from their behavior and onto your reaction. It's a psychological pivot. And it works because you care. Because you're wired for empathy. And they know that. They rely on it. But now you see it. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. Enough to realize this isn't accidental. This isn't misunderstanding. This is a system. And once you see the system, it's hard to unsee it. Every interaction starts to feel different. Less emotional. More revealing. Like you're finally watching the machinery instead of getting caught in it. And that's the shift. The moment where confusion starts turning into clarity. And clarity is something a covert narcissist cannot control. When their patterns stop working, they don't suddenly become honest. They escalate, but quietly. More withdrawal. More subtle blame. More emotional distance disguised as overwhelm or stress. The intimacy fades even further. Conversations feel hollow. Physical closeness feels disconnected. And you start realizing this was never mutual. It only felt that way when you were giving more. They become harder to reach. Not physically, but emotionally. Like trying to grab onto something that dissolves the moment you touch it. And here's where it gets painful. Not because of what they're doing, but because of what you finally understand. They were never meeting you at the depth you believed they were capable of. The version of them you fell for? It wasn't consistent. It wasn't stable. It was situational. And that realization cuts deeper than any argument ever could. You start grieving something that never fully existed. And that kind of grief is heavy. Because there's no clear ending. Just a slow, painful clarity. They may accuse you of changing. Becoming distant. Cold. And in a way, you have. But not in the way they think. You've become aware. And awareness breaks the illusion. The dynamic begins to collapse. Not dramatically. Quietly. The tension shifts. The emotional pull weakens. And they feel it, even if they can't fully articulate why. And instead of repairing it, they often retreat further. Because true intimacy requires accountability. And that's something they've spent their entire lives avoiding. So what's left is silence. Distance. And the undeniable truth that this connection was never what it appeared to be. And now you're here. Sitting with the truth. Not the version you hoped for, but the one you can finally see clearly. And as painful as it is, there's something grounding about it. Because clarity gives you something they never could, stability. A sense of reality that isn't constantly shifting. And that matters more than you might realize right now. You start reconnecting with yourself. Slowly. Carefully. Learning to trust your instincts again. The same instincts you were taught to doubt. And it feels unfamiliar at first. Even uncomfortable. Because you're no longer filtering your emotions through someone else's reactions. You're finally hearing your own voice again. The patterns don't disappear overnight. The questions linger. The what-ifs still echo. But they get quieter. Less convincing. And something else begins to take their place. Boundaries. Not walls, but clarity. A quiet understanding of what you will and won't tolerate moving forward. You realize intimacy isn't supposed to feel like confusion, or exhaustion, or constant self-doubt. It's supposed to feel safe, steady, good. And once you experience that difference, even just within yourself, you can't go back. You won't go back. Because now you see it. The patterns. The manipulation. The illusion. And more importantly, you see yourself clearly again. And that's the truth they could never take from you. Once you see through the mask, you don't just lose them, you finally find yourself.